We're often told a very specific story about India's fight for freedom. It's a story that starts with a bang in 1857. But what if that wasn't the beginning? What if the real story, the one that truly explains everything, began a full 100 years earlier? Today, we're diving into the forgotten struggles that set the stage for that massive revolt.
Right. So when you think of India's independence struggle, what's the first date that comes to mind? For almost everyone, it's 1857. The Sepoy Mutiny, the Great Revolt. It's chapter 1 in all the popular history books. It's the moment we all point to as the beginning.
But let's pause and ask a question. What if 1857 wasn't the first page at all? What if it was actually the dramatic, fiery conclusion to a century-long story of struggle that had been bubbling just beneath the surface the whole time?
Okay, so let's reframe how we look at this. I want you to think about the 1857 revolt not as a sudden storm that came out of nowhere, but as a massive earthquake. And as you know, major earthquakes don't just happen. They're almost always preceded by hundreds of smaller tremors, these pre-shocks that signal a bigger event is on its way. And this isn't just a cool metaphor, it's a really crucial historical argument. The idea is that 1857 was the grand finale, the culmination of countless local uprisings, big and small, that stretched all the way back to the mid-1700s.
So, what was causing all these pre-shocks? I mean, why were people fighting back again and again for 100 years straight? Let's break down the deep-seated grievances that were fueling all of this simmering, widespread anger. This really gets to the heart of the problem. It shows a fundamental shift in how the government worked. You see, before the British, there was this kind of codependent relationship. If a king's taxes were too high, he might lower them because he needed the farmers to stay and work the land. There was a way to get your grievances heard. But under the British, that just vanished. The new system was purely about extraction. The law wasn't there to provide justice. It became a weapon to enforce tax collection, no matter what the human cost was. So the first major cause was political. When the British East India Company came in and removed a local king, they weren't just changing the person sitting on the throne. Oh no, they were setting off an economic bomb. All of a sudden, the nobles who advised the king, the soldiers who protected him, the artisans who made everything for the royal court, all of them were out of a job. An entire local economy just collapsed overnight. And then came the economic devastation, and this was a brutal pincer movement that attacked both the farm and the workshop, leaving millions of people with absolutely nowhere to go. For farmers, it became a terrible, vicious cycle. First, the company hits them with impossibly high new land taxes. To pay, they're forced to take loans from moneylenders at insane interest rates. Of course, they eventually can't pay it back. And that's when the moneylender, with the full backing of the British legal system, seizes their land. Just like that, generations of ownership, gone. The pain didn't stop on the farms. On the trade front, the story is just as grim. In the mid-1700s, India was a manufacturing powerhouse, exporting these beautiful textiles all over the world. But then, Britain's Industrial Revolution kicks into high gear, and they completely flip the script. They flood India with cheap machine-made cloth, which completely bankrupts India's incredible artisans. India goes from being the world's workshop to being a captive market for British goods. And finally, the third cause was an assault on culture itself. There was this constant racial superiority from the British. Christian missionaries were becoming more and more active, which was seen as a direct threat to both Hinduism and Islam. And new Western laws started interfering with deeply held local traditions. To a lot of people, it felt like their entire way of life was under attack. So with all this pressure building from every angle, political, economic, cultural, who were the people who finally decided they'd had enough and were going to fight back? Well, the answer is just about everyone who had lost something. It was this incredible coalition of the dispossessed. You had peasants who lost their land, artisans who lost their jobs, tribal communities pushed out of their forests, deposed rulers, their jobless soldiers, and religious leaders trying to protect their faith. All these different groups suddenly had a common enemy. But, this diverse coalition didn't all fight back in the same way. It makes sense, right? Their specific problems shaped how they responded. So historians usually group all these uprisings into 4 main categories. And you can see right away, civil rebellions were by far the most common, making up half of all the uprisings during this time. This goes right back to those deposed rulers we talked about.
They provided a familiar leader, a banner that different parts of society, from nobles to peasants, could rally behind. That's why they were so frequent.
So, what exactly were these civil rebellions? Well, you can think of them as attempts to restore the old world. A dethroned king or a powerful landlord would rise up, and everyone else who had lost their place in the new system, the old soldiers, the artisans, the peasants, would join them. The goal was simple: kick out the British and bring back the world they knew.
Now, peasants were a huge part of those civil rebellions, absolutely. But sometimes they rose up on their own. These movements weren't about restoring a king. They were purely about survival. Their uprisings were laser-focused on the immediate sources of their misery: the tax collectors, the new landlords, and the moneylenders who were taking everything from them. Tribal resistance was something totally unique. For these communities, the fight was about defending their entire way of life, their sacred connection to the land. They fought fiercely against all the outsiders, the Diku, who were coming into their forests, messing with their economies, and trying to impose foreign laws and religions.
And finally, we have the sepoy mutinies. These were like the early tremors happening right inside the company's own military machine. Indian soldiers revolting over bad pay, racial insults, and, most famously, orders that went against their religious beliefs. These were flashing red lights warning of the huge explosion that was on its way.
Okay, so this is the crucial question. You've got all these different fires burning all across the country: civil, peasant, tribal, and sepoy rebellions. How in the world did they all come together to create that single massive inferno of 1857?
Well, just look at this timeline. Resistance wasn't a rare thing. It was a constant feature of life under the early British. From the Sannyasi Rebellion way back in the 1770s to tribal revolts to princely revolts, decade after decade, the pot was just simmering and the pressure was building and building. See, each of these pre-shocks, even when they were crushed, left a legacy. They created a shared memory of defiance, and they fertilized a landscape of deep, deep anger. So for 100 years, this whole process was basically loading a giant powder keg, just waiting for a spark.
And that brings us to the most important point of all, those infamous greased cartridges of 1857. They weren't the spark that lit the fuse. They were just the final trigger. The real fuel, the anger and resentment, had been piling up for a century. The 1857 revolt wasn't the start of the fire. It was the inevitable, massive explosion. So it kind of leaves us with a question, doesn't it? If the big, world-changing events are really just the culmination of countless smaller, overlooked struggles, what are the important tremors happening all around us right now that maybe we're missing? Definitely something to think about. Thanks for joining me.